we've seen news from around the country about big fights over redistricting. There was, of course, a lot of attention in Texas because of debates about redistricting in the Texas legislature. And then California, the governor there was saying, well, maybe we'll get into it too, and other states. And so kind of there's been this big national fight, and it's very political, over redistricting in advance of the midterms. And we've also been debating it here in Utah, but a little bit differently. So I want to ask you, in the context of everything that's going on, what is the big fight over or connected to the redistricting issue in Utah right now?
Yeah, it's really kind of interesting how it is. We are in the same dealing with the same issue of redistricting, but the approach is quite different. In fact, there's kind of a funny to my mind at least. Maybe this shows kind of humor that makes sense to me, but that what's happening is that Utah is adopting, or a better way to say this is, some people in Utah would like us to adopt the system that California is now trying to get away from, in order to create, to go back to gerrymandering, which was the process before. But let me try and describe, I guess, basically what's happening in Utah as it relates to redistricting and gerrymandering, for that matter. So a number of years ago, citizens groups were concerned that the legislature was not responsive to them in terms of they felt that the legislature was too political as they were creating the legislative districts. The challenge that they have, of course, is that the Utah Constitution specifically says that the boundaries of electoral districts in Utah are to be established by the legislature. But they thought that they could get around that by proposing a ballot initiative. It's sort of created by voters, and if it gets enough signatures, it goes on the ballot, and that becomes a law, just like any other law that the legislature passed. And the particular law creates a commission that has to give some proposed boundaries for electoral districts to the legislature, and the legislature decides what to do with those. And they have to decide what to do with those, again, because of that constitutional language, because the requirement that the legislature is the one who has to ultimately take responsibility for creating the districts in this state. And the legislature, so the commission comes up with a proposal. The legislature doesn't approve any of those and creates their own boundaries. The question then goes through the courts up to the Utah Supreme Court in summer of 2024. And in 2024, the Utah Supreme Court holds kind of a really striking, almost shocking ruling that regardless of what the Constitution says about the relative power of the legislature and citizens and all of that, the courts themselves have to determine what the unwritten intent of voters was, and to make sure that becomes the law. Well, what does that mean in practice? In this case, it means that the courts are going to have to decide. Voters, when they went to the polls and they approved this process, and they created a statute like any other statute, it becomes kind of a super statute because the legislature can't really change it unless the courts now approve the changes and say, oh, that's what we think that voters would have wanted. There's all kinds of problems with that, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about that as we go along. But that's what set up a very recent ruling from a lower court. So this is a district court, a trial judge in Utah, who said, well, the legislature in what they proposed, they didn't get close enough to what we think the voters would have wanted, and so the order goes to the legislature to create a new set of boundaries and give that to the court for the court to determine whether that's an appropriate boundary or not. And I hope just by describing that, and obviously I feel I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I think in trying to describe that, I think you can see some potential problems. Like, really, are the courts really the ones to do that? Does our constitutional system really allow courts to superintend the process? Why, if the citizens are just creating a statute like any other statute, can't the legislature amend that or appeal it just like they would a law that's passed by, in kind of the more normal format? So those are the kind of situations that have risen. And that makes our situation quite different from Texas or California, where the aim is kind of more partisan. What we want in those states, I think, the proponents are saying, we want maps that get a result of plus D or plus R. And in Utah, the question is, what is the court's role? What is the legislature's role? How do people govern themselves? Can we keep that? Basically, all of those kinds of questions.
So essentially, the debate in Utah is who gets to draw the maps and how do they draw them, right?
Right. And on redistricting, that's the key question. There's an underlying question, of course, and that is, what does the Constitution mean and who gets to determine that, which is an even more important question. But you're right, that's kind of the bottom line for this specific controversy.
So, Bill, I want to ask you about this kind of deeper constitutional debate you kind of alluded to that. Again, just as a casual observer, it seems like the core issue is not really debate over what the district maps or the legislative maps look like. It's who draws them, how do they get to draw them, kind of who decides. But this is, again, a deeper question between, you mentioned this idea of sort of super statutes passed by ballot initiative versus, regular laws passed by the legislature. Right. Can you get into that a little bit?
Sure. The thing that I think is sometimes difficult to understand in our system is we typically think about the way things are done in the U.S. government. We think of 3 branches of government, and that's still the case. That's true in Utah, but there's a slight variation with these ballot initiatives where the people themselves can create their own law, at least initiate their own laws. But what I think many people don't realize is that power is contained in the state constitution in the same article that describes the legislative power, and it says the legislative power has to be shared between the legislature and, in some specific ways that are laid out in the Constitution, the people themselves, so they can directly make laws, like we're used to more from California, and a lot of Western states have that kind of approach. What's interesting is that this debate is always kind of, I think, skips over that reality of we have to understand where the nature of this authority comes from in our Constitution. And what does the Constitution itself say? And the Constitution says the legislature has the legislative power, and the people also have the legislative power in the way described in this Constitution. And those ways are they can either initiate a law if they don't like what the legislature is doing. They can always say, well, we think we got a better idea. We'll take it straight to the voters, and the voters can approve that. Then it becomes a law, just like what the legislature passes. Or they can do a referendum if the legislature passes a law that most people don't like. And we see that happening, every couple of years. That's pretty normal. What's become challenging is that the court seems to be looking at their role not as applying the existing law, but as kind of trying to superintend the legislative process to, I assume, out of a motive of trying to protect the rights of the people that are described in the Constitution. But in doing that, they've actually undermined the rights of the people in the Constitution by taking away their real authority, which is to determine who represents them. And of course, that power doesn't just disappear. Power doesn't go into a vacuum. It stays, but where does it stay? It goes to the courts, and I think that's the nature of the concern that we have about what's going on with redistricting, but with issues like abortion, funding for schools. All of these things have become issues where the court has the final say rather than the people themselves through their representatives or even through ballot initiatives.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.